Hello, Dr. Cath here again, and today we're going to celebrate the amphibians and reptiles we have in Shropshire, and here indeed be dragons. We have 9 of the 13 native species of reptiles and amphibians here in Shropshire. We don't have smooth snakes, sand lizards, natterjacks or pool frogs, but we have all the others, which is a really good reason to support the Shropshire Wildlife Trust. So if you're not a member and you're inspired by this and you would like to join, please do. You can join through our website, and you'd be very, very welcome, as are all the amphibians and reptiles in Shropshire. And people who work in these creatures refer to them as herpetofauna. So as a whole, we can call them herps, but amphibians and reptiles is what they are. So we start off with the newts. We have smooth newts on the top left here. They're the commonest species. Great crested newts, which I'm sure you've all heard all about, because they're having been quite an endangered species, they now have to be considered in building applications and so on, and rightly so. They're absolutely beautiful and they really need a place in the county to live. Palmate newts at the top left here, these are one of the smaller ones. Common frogs and common toads, which you'll all be familiar with, and then the legless ones. So we have adders and grass snakes. These are our true snakes, top left and top right. We have slow worms, which aren't a snake at all, they're just a lizard with no legs. And we have what they used to call a common lizard, but is now referred to as a viviparous lizard. There's a little green fella on the right here. And just a little bit of myth busting. Adders are the only venomous snake in Britain. The others are completely harmless. They're all much more frightened of you than you are of them, and they will do their very best to avoid you. None of them are well, the amphibians are a bit slimy, but snakes aren't. They're actually very, very dry to the touch. Adders aren't all that poisonous. I shouldn't say poisonous, I should say venomous. Poisonous is poisonous if you eat it. Venomous is poisonous if it bites you. Yeah. I've been bitten by one. I didn't realise at the time. I was grubbling about under a blackberry bush at brown moss, and I got bitten. And when I looked at my arm, I thought I'd been bitten by 2 horseflies walking hand in hand. 2 little red holes. And I didn't feel very well, and the arm swelled up a bit, but I kind of disregarded it and got on with life. And it was only 5-6 days later when I saw my brother, who worked for the Forestry Commission, and he said, "Good heavens, where did you get bitten by an adder?" And I was really disappointed, because I'd have been terribly excited if I'd known. The best thing was, it did give us a record of adders at brown moss, and they hadn't been recorded there before. So absolutely fabulous things. They're really great. A couple more myths. Toads do not have a magic stone in their head, whatever Shakespeare believed. Toadstones are actually the fossilized teeth of an extinct type of fish that was common in the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. So that's 200 million years ago. But people thought they were out of the heads of toads, and they were thought to be magic because they could tell you if something was poisoned, and they could cure poisoning. So the medieval people thought they were great things to have, but unfortunately they don't work. So fossilized, nothing to do with toads. And last myth is that licking toads will not get you high. Certainly not the toads we have in this country. This is a cane toad. They do have a poisonous excretion in their skin, which can get you high, but it also can be fatal. We don't get them in this country. They're native to South America, and of course were regrettably introduced into Australia, where they've become a major problem. So don't go around licking toads. They won't enjoy it, and you won't either. So back to the real thing. Where do they like to live? We very rarely see most of our reptiles, and to be honest, amphibians can be a bit difficult to find, but Here's the sort of place that adders love to live. This is Cath Common. Cath Common is actually the only place you can find all of our Shropshire species of herpetofauna in the same area. But lovely sort of heathy, heathery, open spaces, pools. So Cath Common, Cramer Gutter, Fens and Whittle moss and brown moss, as I said, are good places to not necessarily to find adders, but at least to know they're there. If you really want to see one, the best thing to do is to go on an organised walk somewhere like Fens and Wixel, and you've got a much better chance of seeing them if somebody who knows where they are can go with you. Fens and Wixel moss, again, lovely brackeny basking places. They like somewhere they can coil up in the sun, and plenty of places to hide underground as well. Slow worms you can also find in these sort of places, but also much more commonly in gardens. They like rough grassland, they like woodland edges, gardens particularly with long grass and log piles and things. Railway allotments are really good for them. Railway embankments, lovely, well-drained, grassy places like this, and also in derelict urban environments. These are really good for slow worms, what they call brownfield sites. Slow worms are semi-fossorial, which means they like to go down holes in the ground. They're not actually very good burrowers, but they will use any hole in the ground, crack in the earth, to hide themselves away. So these are really good places to find them. Similarly, the viviparous lizards, but much the same areas as slow worms. Not quite as common in gardens, though. They particularly like boardwalks to bask in the sun. This one's at Gore Stuffy, in one of the Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust reserves. But you can quite often see them on these exposed areas in marshland and fenland. It gives them somewhere dry to sit up out of the marsh and in the sun. Grass snakes are much more associated with water, so you'll usually find them anywhere that's got some water nearby. So canals, ponds, lakes, the adjoining grasslands, those sort of places, low intensity farmland, heaths, derelict urban areas, and gardens that have ponds in them are very good areas for them. They're also very keen on muck heaps and compost heaps. So if you've got a good compost heap, the chances are there are grass snakes somewhere around. Newts, mostly associated with ponds on account of them being amphibians, but they're only there for a very short time in the year, only for breeding. The rest of the time they're in dampish areas, long grass, under hedges, these sort of places. They're found across the county. The great crested newts, found across the county. You can see them in farm ponds, and of course with the loss of so many farm ponds from our landscape, turning more to garden ponds, especially larger ones. So shallow lakes, disused canals, this sort of place. Good place to spot them in Telford, the old canal basin at Granville Country Park. You might not see them, but you'll see bubbles rising to the surface, which in the springtime, which indicates they're there. Mostly they're active at night. So one of the ways to survey them is to take a bright torch and have a look at the surface of the pond after dark, and you might see them sort of hanging in the water there. Smooth newts, very similar habitat requirement to the great crested newts. Palmate newts actually prefer the shallow pools on acidic soils. So this one's up on the Longmynd, but Cath Common, these sort of places are really good for them. And interestingly, during the breeding season, the male ones develop black webbing on their back feet. This is why they're called palmate newts. They look like they're wearing a little pair of black galoshes. They're ever so sweet. Don't have the orange underside that the other two species do. Common frogs, very widespread. They like damp areas, long grass, woodlands, ponds, ditches, garden ponds for breeding. And they're a common species, and you'll probably see them in your garden. Toads, very similar, very widespread. They actually are more inclined to breed in the pond that they themselves were a tadpole in. So they have ancestral ponds, which is why you get these troops of toads crossing roads to get to their ancestral pond. They also prefer rather deeper ponds than frogs. So slightly different requirements, but again, what they want is that cover in the in long damp grass during the daytime, and avoiding the sun, unlike the lizards and the snakes. So what sort of lifestyle do these creatures have? Obviously, reptiles breed on the land, and amphibians breed in the water, which is really the main difference. Remember, amphibians actually spend most of the year on dry land, probably in a damp place, but certainly out of the water. During the breeding season, you often see them, and they'll cool down in water as well. So you will get them around your pond all year round. It's the dampness they're after, not actually the water. In reptiles, despite the fact that most species of reptile in the world lay eggs, giving birth to live young is advantageous in a cooler climate, because the mother can better control the temperature for the embryos. So this one's a slow worm. They're a live breeder. They give birth to baby slow worms. The only reptile that lays eggs in Shropshire is the grass snake. And remember, they're after the compost heaps and muck heaps, which help them keep their eggs warm. They lay their eggs in decomposing vegetation, which will act as an incubator for them. So here's the slow worm with its live young. Adder would be similar. And here's a little baby lizard. Again, viviparous lizards. Viviparous means that it has live young. The grass snake, with rather leathery eggs, they're not hard like a bird's egg. They have this rather leathery skin which protects the embryo, and of course it's in decomposing vegetation, keeping it warm. We're not really warm enough here for the smooth snakes and things that lay eggs in the ground, because they have no mechanism to keep them warm, unlike birds. Reptiles, the amphibians are laying their eggs in water, so it tends to have a fairly steady temperature, and you can tell the difference between frog spawn and toad spawn, shown here. Frog spawn comes in clumps, and the toad spawn in strings, and you can see all the individual eggs lined up in this sort of rope of spawn that is tied around water plants. They have the jelly on them, which protects them against predators to a degree, and also against pathogens, and it insulates the egg, so it keeps them warm. Frogs spawn in colder areas tends to have a lot more jelly around it. The frogs and the toads have dark coloured eggs, which absorb warmth from the sun and protect the embryo from ultraviolet light. Newts have a slightly different way of doing it. They lay their eggs individually. This is a smooth newt, and the top left here is laying an egg, and on the right hand side, it's folding the leaf around its egg, and this is a smooth newt egg folded up into a leaf. As you can see, it's a much paler egg. It doesn't need the protection from UV because it's laid away from the sun. It would be no advantage at all to it to be dark coloured. So they're hidden away and they're pale coloured. These are some frog tadpoles. You can tell a frog tadpole from a toad tadpole or a toadpole or whatever by these sort of golden spots that develop on the frog tadpoles. The toadpoles toad tadpoles stay black right through the metamorphosis. We've all seen this in biology classes when we were kids, or even with the tank of tadpoles when you were in primary school. There always seemed to be a tank of tadpoles, which usually ended up eating each other. The development of these amphibians rather depends on the conditions, and it's very clever the way they do it, because during hot weather there can be a risk of the pond drying up, so the eggs and the tadpoles develop very quickly. Because they develop quickly, they don't have as much time for feeding, so the froglets and toadlets that emerge are much smaller. In cooler weather, they develop slower, they eat more, and when they metamorphosize into frogs and toads and newts, they're a lot larger, so that's an advantage to them. But they can avoid the danger of their pool drying out by growing quickly. Newt, they don't have, baby newt is technically an eft, and they can actually delay their metamorphosis if they're not big enough, and overwinter as efts in the water, emerging in spring as much larger metamorphs, much larger newtlets. These are efts. These are smooth newt efts, and one great crested newt eft. I think it's rather obvious feathery gills, and they will retain this over the winter before they metamorphosize, so that they can breathe under the water, so they can stay within the pool. So what do they eat, all these things? Lizards, and slow worms of course are a lizard, eat small invertebrates, flies, spiders, snails, things. They hunt by day, and they use sight and scent to catch their prey. The slow worms then are known as a gardener's friend because they eat a lot of pest species like the slugs and snails and things. And you can see from its teeth here that it actually has a formidable set of teeth, which are perfectly adapted for catching things like slippery slugs. Adders will take small mammals, voles and mice, and also lizards. They'll also eat frogs, newts, small birds, chicks. Of course, they have the venom to disable their prey, and they swallow their prey whole, as do grass snakes. Because they like to be in the water, they eat a lot of frogs and toads and newts. And obviously this one hasn't read the thing about great crested newts being endangered. This one is particularly endangered. It's busy being eaten by grass snake. They don't have venom, so they have to hunt using surprise to grab their prey. And they will actually wind themselves around it. They're not truly a constrictor, but they will they'll hold their prey by winding around it. But they like to eat things in the water, so they can sneak up and grab quite easily. Newts, again carnivorous, they'll eat frog tadpoles, they'll eat invertebrates, smaller newts even. And palmate newts have a sticky tongue, so they can catch their prey, as do frogs, of course. Frogs and toads are active at night, and again, much loved by gardeners because they're eating invertebrates and spiders and the slugs and the worms and ants and things. They sneak up on their prey and use their sticky tongue to catch it. Really big toads will eat things like baby slow worms, tiny grass snakes, younger toads, and even harvest mice. So they're actually quite a wide range of things that they can eat. Tadpoles generally start off eating algae and plant matter and go on to be carnivorous. Frogs, very much similar range of foods. So what about this strange skin that snakes have? The skin that is not slimy, remember. Snakes are covered by these overlapping ridged scales, and it's actually cornified skin. It's lots of keratin in it, and the scales are made from layers of epidermis, layers of skin, which folded back on each other. And it's thinnest at the fold, which, even though the scales are inflexible, the folded structure allows it quite a lot of expansion. So they can eat quite large prey for their size. You see these pictures of the snake with the big bulge in it. And it also helps if they're carrying eggs or young, they can get fatter in the appropriate place. Lizards have bone scales, osteoderms, within the within the dermis, within the skin. These are little bony plates. And in slow worms, they actually form a rigid inner armour which protects the insides of the snake. I once found a dead slow worm and decomposed it, so I collected all its bones and the hundreds of osteoderms from it. Really, it's like completely plated. And I think I counted 568 or something in quite a small slow worm. So absolutely fascinating the way they have different structures to protect themselves. Amphibians, of course, have a permeable skin. They act as a respiratory organ and can regulate the water level within it. And they're kept moist by secretions from mucus glands. The thing with the toads having they have several kinds of glands. Toads also have this poison gland in them, and they can secrete unpleasant fluid to deter predators. But one thing they all have in common is that they all have to shed their skin periodically. The very outer layer of the skin is shed several times a year, even in adults. And in newts and frogs and toads, they eat the old skins. The lizards and slow worms quite often shed their skin in pieces, but snakes will usually remove it all in one go. So it starts around their mouths and they rub it on stones and things until it starts peeling back. And even the scale over the eye is complete in the slough that you can find. So this is the sloughed skin of an adder. And the external markings quite often remain as shadows on the sloughed skin. And you can sometimes identify what the slough was from by these shadowy markers. Obviously, this one's an adder skin, and you can see the zigzags on its back as a live adder would have, a complete adder, rather. The slow worm shuffling out of its cast-off skin, which is not nearly as complete looking as the adders. What about the senses? Another thing about snakes is this forked tongue. All pictures of the snake in the Garden of Eden and all that sort of thing. We see this poking out forked tongue, which is a bit slightly creepy. But it's not a sting. It's actually a sense organ. They have a well-developed sense of smell. A lot of their hunting is done by scent, and the forked tongue of the snake and the lobed tongue of the lizard, the slow worm on the bottom right here, it collects chemical information from the surroundings. So they flick the tongue in and out a lot. Molecules are collected on it, and then they take it back into their mouth and they insert it into, this sounds great, doesn't it? Insert it into the vomeronasal organ in the roof of the mouth. So they poke their tongue into this gap in the roof of its mouth, and it can tell them what's around. They almost taste the air. It's particularly well developed in snakes. They have this long tongue, and there's a notch in their upper jaw that it protrudes through. Lizards have to open their mouth a bit to stick their tongue out. And as you can see, it's lobed rather than forked. Snakes don't have ears. They don't really hear the same way as we do, but they can detect vibrations from the ground. Lizards and slow worms do have ears, In the case of slow worms, they're covered in scales, but they hear in a different way. Newts hear, in inverted commas, vibrations, and snakes in the same way as snakes, but newts have a muscular connection between the inner ear and the bones on their shoulders. So they don't have external ears at all, but they have this link, and they can actually feel the vibrations coming up through their front legs, transferring into their inner ear. So they hear through their feet. Frogs and toads, of course, are very vocal. There's the croaking sound. None of the other herps do that. Because they're very vocal, they actually have very good hearing. They have good eyesight as well, but primarily out of water. So they have their eyes set up on the tops of their heads, and you can see behind the eye and just below it is their external eardrum, which is covered by a circular membrane. So you can see that circular patch, and that's its ear. And so they have very good hearing. All of these species are what was always referred to as cold-blooded. It was more properly described as ectothermic. They take in the warmth from their surroundings rather than generating it themselves. And this makes they're a bit sluggish and unable to feed or to breed if it's cold. But there's a huge advantage because they can get by with an awful lot less food. Sometimes as little as 10% of the requirement for food of a endotherm, a warm-blooded creature of a similar size. And it means that they have to feed less often. Food shortages are less critical to them, and they can actually maintain a larger population on lower food resources. So they can devote a lot more energy to breeding. So it's actually quite a good strategy. And how they do it is the reptiles can maintain a body temperature well above their surroundings, but they need to get warm by basking. They have to get up to operating temperature, if you like. Adders and grass snakes, viviparous lizards, bask out in the open. They absorb the sun. Adders have a very highly developed thermoregulation system. They bask for a long time. They can flatten their bodies, so they're exposing more of their skin to the sunshine. Other kinds, these slow worms particularly, absorb heat from the substrate, from the surface they're on. So these are some slow worms, and they've been underneath a corrugated sheet. One of the best ways of monitoring herps is by putting down sheets of corrugated iron or even roofing felt, and you'll find these animals basking underneath it. So they're taking in the warmth from the earth rather than from the sun. The technical term for that is thigothermic, which I think is absolutely wonderful. The adders and the grass snakes and the viviparous lizards are heliotherms. They take in the warmth from the sun. Thigothermic, what a brilliant word. Remember that one for Scrabble. So they have different operating temperatures. The slow worm has the lowest of our set of herps. They're operational at 23 degrees centigrade. Adders have the highest temperature at 33 degrees, but interestingly enough, they're the only one whose range extends as far as the Arctic Circle. So they're very, very efficient, even though they have this slightly higher operating temperature. Amphibians don't bask because they risk drying out, and they regulate their body temperature by changing their microhabitat. So they can withstand a wider range of temperature. Newts, for example, can swim in water underneath ice. You know, they don't feel the cold very well. And on land, they avoid light and heat, so they actually hide themselves away and stay cool. If it's too hot in the summer, they will estivate, which is the summer version of hibernating. So they'll actually put themselves into shutdown. They use their surroundings as a heat sink, so they'll lie on Earth to cool Earth to take the heat out of their bodies. And all of our reptiles and amphibians, of course, go into hibernation for the winter. They need a frost-free place to hibernate. They go underground, they go in root holes, the bases of compost heaps, under rubble, ants' nests, tussocks, that sort of place. A few of male frogs will hibernate in the bottom of ponds, but most of them on land. There's a danger, of course, that if a pond freezes over, any frogs hibernating in it could suffocate. So look after your ponds during the winter. How do they defend themselves? Okay, the adders have poison, so if push comes to shove, they can bite. Anything that doesn't have poison has to have some other form of self-defense. And this is a grass snake playing dead. They do it very well. I had a friend who collected one, believed dead, off a road, because he was interested in that sort of thing, put it in the car, and about 4 miles down the road, it woke up again, which was a bit of a shock to everybody else in the car. So this one's playing dead quite effectively. They will also, when handled, produce a rather unpleasant smelling secretion, for want of a better word, from their bottoms. So not only will it look as if it's dead, it'll also make a terrible stink and make you want to drop it instantly. Lizards and slow worms are well known for being able to shed a dead tail. This unfortunate soul has just done so. Generally speaking, this means that the tail will go on twitching, and if something is trying to catch the lizard and eat it, the chances are that the surviving bit will stay exactly, the non-tail bit, the front end, stays still. The tail twitches a bit, the predator will grab it, and the rest of the lizard can run away and grow a new tail. They always look a bit stumpy once they've shed their tail. And interestingly enough, they can only do it once. So once you've done it once, that's it. It's not like a cat having 9 lives. Once you've lost your tail, you can't do it again. What can we do to look after these creatures? All our reptile species are protected by law, but the threats are still there. Is habitat loss with agricultural intensification, development of brownfield sites, natural succession. Things will, they change as things grow up. Heathland fires, very dangerous for herpetofauna. Pond filling in, the loss of farm ponds, over 50% in the last 50 years or so. Tidying up, very bad for wildlife. Tidying up, they don't like it tidy. Even total neglect doesn't help them. So there's a lot of things causing our reptiles and amphibians to lose their environments. Changes in farm practice have lost a lot of hibernation sites for them. Things like using slurry instead of manure, which means that farms don't have a long-term manure heap, midden. A reptile can't overwinter in a slurry pit. It's no good at all to them. Loss of dry stone walls with all those little crevices and bits you can get under. Loss of hedges, none of that undergrowth they can hide under. So their breeding sites, the hibernating sites, all that sort of thing. Human persecution is still a problem. Not everybody's as understanding as you are. If they see anything that looks like a snake, they're frightened by them. They still want to drive them off or kill them. The invertebrate prey of some of these things is killed off by pesticides. It's just not there for them anymore. Slowworms and lizards particularly can be predated by cats. And some of them are just naturally poor dispersers. The slowworms aren't very good at moving out into new areas. So localized small populations can be at risk. What can we do to help them? Your garden pond could be invaluable. Slowworms and grass snakes particularly like gardens. Ponds are brilliant, particularly for the grass snake, remember. It's not so good if you have goldfish, because quite often a goldfish is just a nice sized snack for a grass snake. But if you want newts and things in your pond, you're better not to have fish anyway. So, wildlife ponds generally don't have fish, but they might well have a grass snake. Rockeries are great for them. They give nice sites for basking for the lizards and slowworms and snakes and things. Rocks for the slowworms and people to hide under. And apparently rockeries are getting back on trend. So they're a much more in thing to have in your garden. So a nice natural looking rockery could be a great thing for the reptiles in your garden. You can build special places for them to hibernate. There's several ways of doing this. And this is the Wildlife Watch. You can download this off the Wildlife Watch site and dig your own hibernaculum. It's a slightly more sophisticated. This is an egg-laying heap for grass snakes with decomposing vegetation and compost and wood chips and things, and another way of doing a hibernaculum with the logs and the covering of soil. It gives them a nice, safe, frost-free place that they can hibernate. Log piles are great for them. They're full of insects, so there's lots of food and also those frost-free places to hibernate. It's very important. You put these in a sunny spot. You've given your reptiles and amphibians a place to hibernate, but also remember they're feeding, so don't use pesticides in your garden. If you've got a pond, it's good to have long grass close to it. Maybe a pile of stones or some paving or something close to it, which gives your newly emerged metamorphs, the baby toads and the baby frogs and newts, somewhere to hide in when they come out of the pond. Don't disturb your compost heap during the winter when they're hibernating, or from late June to September when you could have grass snake eggs in it. There'd be nothing worse than disturbing a nice nest of grass snakes. It would be absolutely dreadful. And don't use flexible small gauge netting, because it can be very easy for slowworms and grass snakes and things to get trapped in them. Don't forget, don't move spawn or tadpoles into different ponds. You can spread diseases, you can spread non-native plant species. Ponds that have already got spawn in have probably got as much as they can support. If they haven't got spawn in them, they're probably not suitable for frogs. Frogs will colonize ponds very, very quickly. If they were suitable and well established, they'd already be there. And don't let your pond freeze over. Float a ball in it to keep a hole open so that air can get through and gases can't build up under the ice. And if it does freeze, defrost it by putting a pan of hot water onto the surface of the ice. If you break the ice manually with the coal hammer or something like that, it can make a shock which can kill the inhabitants of the pond. So lots of things you can do. These are little emerging lizards, little emerging toads. They all need a place to hide, so some long grass can be a really, really important thing for them, and somewhere they can crawl under. When you need to mow the grass, if you've got shorter areas around your pond, go over it first, brushing the grass just to make sure that, just because if you you don't want to mince one up in your mower, do you? So just spend your time, a little bit of time, thinking about how these things live and what they need, which we've been through, and you can do an awful lot in your garden to help these little creatures. Because the most important thing is to look after the natural habitat. There's quite a few of these things that you're not going to get in your garden. The adders won't be in your garden. Viviparous lizards, not so much in gardens. So looking after the wider landscape is really important. Making sure there are areas that these creatures can live their lives in peace, and that there's areas of connection between them so that the amphibians and reptiles that are in them can disperse across the county without too much problem. Even the ones like, as I said, the slow worms that aren't really terribly good dispersers, they're not going to be able to disperse unless there are large areas of habitat they can disperse through and into. So have a think about it. You know what's coming next. Make a big difference. Join Shropshire Wildlife Trust. Look after all the places that these precious reptiles, precious amphibians can live. Have a think about it. A single kilogram of ready-to-cook frog's legs costs twice as much as a month's family membership. So support our herpetofauna, our reptiles and amphibians, our little dragons in Shropshire, and join Shropshire Wildlife Trust. You can do it online. There's a join us bit on our website. So please do that. And please look out for these things in your garden and take care of them. Because where would we be without a few dragons? Thank you very much.